Great. Yeah, thanks for having me. So yeah, this presentation presents some of my PhD research, which was entitled The Meta of Madness, How the Social Framing of Anomalous Experiences Affects Their Ontology, in which I looked at how the social framings and responses to anomalous experiences affect the ontology of those experiences. So I looked at the intersubjectivity of anomalous experience and then how the social framings of such experiences are part of that intersubjectivity. So looking at psychiatry and its affectivity as an intersubjective field. So in this presentation, I'll start by looking at first what are anomalous experiences, what is their relation to intersubjectivity or intersubjective trust. So I'll start by looking at an account of their intersubjective nature, which I look at Matthew Ratcliffe's account of anomalous experience. And then I'll turn to the intersubjective field that frames anomalous experiences. So in the West, the dominant framing and way of responding to them is through the institution of psychiatry. So how does psychiatry maintain or not maintain intersubjective trust is what we're looking at. And looking at its ways of relating, conceptualizing, institutionalizing, and the affective experience of the process of psychiatrization. So how could this affect one's relationality in general and thus their intersubjectivity? And so in this presentation, I'll focus on the part of the project that looked at epistemic injustice and the kind of epistemic injustice inherent in psychiatry and the kind of relationality that this sets up with people who have anomalous experiences, arguing that it can disrupt their intersubjectivity and thus instigate anomalous experiences or unravel a person further from shared reality. So firstly, what are anomalous experiences? So what do I mean when I say that? So it broadly refers to experiences often associated with the words hallucinations, voice hearing, psychosis. So experiences that don't match up with a consensus, but usually have kind of perceptual-like qualities. So I chose to focus on anomalous experience as a very kind of like broad concept, just as a way to focus on the more experiential rather than like cognitive aspects of madness, but still taking like a kind of wide lens, so to speak, because it's the idea of a feedback loop in which I'm interested in. And it's the experiences which are responded to socially in strong ways. And what I'm interested in is the interactions and feedback loops around these experiences, and then further experiences that may be kind of deemed pathological in more obvious ways, and how the social context of certain paradigms can create such interactions. So yeah, I chose quite like a vague term, anomalous experience, because it's precisely that vagueness and those kind of slippery boundaries of its like extension as a term in which I'm interested in. So I'm concerned with the range of experiences and the range of ways that they may get like caught in this kind of slippery, vague extension of anomalous experience through the ways that they're framed, responded to, norms about them. Um, Okay, so now I'll look at Matthew Ratcliffe's conceptions of anomalous, Matthew Ratcliffe's conception of anomalous experience. So I looked at his framework, which is strongly influenced by Husserl's Phenomenology, and which he applies to formulate a very in-depth account of anomalous experience. And so the starting point is this idea of the structure of intentionality as the theoretical structure of what makes experience possible. So in other words, like the minimal self, which we've probably come across as this idea of pre-reflective consciousness. And so his account of this minimal self is a very rich account. So basically the minimal self implies intersubjective trust and awareness as part of it, rather than that being, a next step. It's part of the most kind of primitive form of consciousness. And this starts from sort of what we know implicitly of pre-reflective awareness, in that we are aware of something. So pre-reflective awareness involves being aware of P. As philosophers, it's always being aware of P. So yeah, his account comes from like honing in on this awareness and kind of illustrating how that includes an awareness of being aware of P in a particular way. So we get to this sort of premise of how experience is spatio-temporal. So we're aware of P, we're aware of its location in space and time, and all our experience is through this locus of space and time. And so from there, he gets to this point about when we're aware of something spatio-temporally, we must be aware of like how we are aware of it. So what kind of intentional state we're in relation to the object of our awareness. So for example, we know we're perceiving P because we can see it here and now in this space and time. Whereas so that he then differentiates that from like if I'm imagining P, then I have an awareness that it's not in the same space and time as the here and now. I'm thinking about it in a different way, or like remembering P is thinking about it, being aware of it at a different time. So he argues that our spatio-temporality necessitates an awareness of different kinds of intentional states. And so he differentiates between the actual intentional state type one is in on the one hand, and an experience that is characteristic of an intentional state type on the other hand. And so he's arguing that these are distinct, so it's possible to be mistaken about what kind of intentional state one is in. For example, a false memory that may actually be an imagining. And so this is how he gets to his account of anomalous experience. But first, I'll just say a little bit more about perception and the here and now. So, yeah, our awareness that we're perceiving something is an awareness of what is here and now, but crucially, this is an awareness that it is real and it's real for everyone to see. So what is here and now is also what is able to be corroborated by other people who are perceiving the world too. So this is intersubjectivity. So like in our awareness of something being a perception, there's an awareness that it's real in the sense that if someone else were to be here, they would be able to perceive it as well. So that he calls habitual trust, as like denoting trust that the world is real and that this is an intersubjective kind of trust. So trust that the world is real for everyone else too. And in this way, he argues that it underscores our awareness of other ways of experiencing things in terms of how they feel in relation to this kind of feeling of realness as being what's present for everyone. So a trust in reality as being shared gives perception its characteristic feel as perception. And so habitual trust is, yeah, affective. It's like an attitude that's naturally immersed into our lives and involves a kind of anticipation, a kind of affective anticipation that coheres and structures the world around us, that's also reliant upon other people corroborating those anticipations. So in this sense, like we all have a stake in each other's reality. We corroborate or correct each other's reality in a minimal way all the time. So crucially, our awareness of which type of intentional state we are in is reliant on this intersubjective trust in reality, a habitual, confident immersion in the world. Um, yeah. And so then on Ratcliffe's account, anomalous experiences are constituted as kind of skews or shifts in this structure of intentionality, where the sense of reality is felt in an unattached way to other people and the social world. So this could be in general, or it could be in a more specific temporary way concerning localized experiences. So he describes it as a kind of blurring of the boundaries of how intentional state types are characterized. Um, and so the consensus world may occupy a different function in relation to how a person structures their experience, and the kind of flagship of reality is placed elsewhere, not with the profile of perception as tightly tied into a pattern of anticipation and corroboration with other people. Um, and so he conceptualizes them like ontologically as like mistaken imaginings. So for example, something that is more akin to an imagination being sort of disguised with perceptual like qualities, but then phenomenologically, he's really drawing our attention to them being so much more than this. Um, so I have a slightly different take in which I don't take them necessarily to be like mistaken imaginings. I don't think this is an exhaustive characterization. But I don't have much time to go into that now. But the important thing for this presentation is that if they can be constituted this way, and we can see how they can be constituted through kind of shifts to the structure of intentionality, or like disrupted connections to habitual trust or intersubjective trust, then we can see how the social world and the intersubjective world is bound up with that. And yeah, so the important thing is that this intersubjective trust connects us to a shared reality with others, and that this structures the way we experience the world. And then importantly, detachment or breakdown of this trust will mean shifts in experience. Reality will feel different, and what is perception or seems like perception will be different. And because this relationship is constitutive, there may be shifts to this structure from different kinds of causes. So, for example, interpersonal events. So, um, like Ratcliffe points to how traumatic experiences may, if they're very traumatic, subvert the sense of reality in a general way to be misaligned with other people, meaning that others are not sources of corroboration but of threat. Um, so we get to this point that intentionality is constitutively dependent on intersubjectivity. So shifts or ruptures in one's ability to feel intersubjective trust will constitute shifts or ruptures to the way that they structure their experience and feel the kinds of intentional states and the kinds of experiences that they are having. So we might call this a kind of transcendental intersubjectivity. Okay. So now, having demonstrated the connection between the structure of experience and how anomalous experiences may be constituted, I'll turn to look at the level of the intersubjective community in Husserl's terms of his levels, and actually looking at how habitual trust or, intersubjective trust may be broken down. And in thinking about how the social contexts that frame anomalous experiences can become part of the structure of those experiences, this implicates psychiatry as the kind of dominant way of framing them. If anomalous experiences may be constituted by ruptures in intersubjective trust, then this implicates psychiatry in how it functions as an intersubjective field, so a site of habitual trust, a site of transcendental intersubjectivity in being a place of relationality. So how does it frame anomalous experiences, and how might this implicate intersubjective trust? So here we're turning to look at the part that the social world plays in maintaining this intersubjective trust. So this trust that what is here and now is what is real, and that importantly, that is what is real for others too. Other people are involved in that realness. So it requires a relationality between people in which there's a pre-reflective trust of each other as intersubjective beings who share a consensus world. So here we're interested in looking at what is the intersubjective field of psychiatry like? Like, what is its affectivity? How is it structured towards people who are psychiatrized? What kinds of relationality does it instigate and uphold, like through its institutional processes? So this is where like criticality comes in and critical phenomenology comes in that we're looking at like if intersubjectivity can be transcendental in terms of affecting the structures that make experience possible, then how might power relations and marginalization come into this? So how could power actually reach down into the transcendental and actually affect the structure of experience? So I'm focusing on the literature of epistemic harm here to illustrate something about such power relations and their kind of pervasiveness in this sense. And I'll make the argument that this pervasiveness can be to the point of breaking down into subjective trust if they sufficiently affect one's relationship to intersubjectivity in general and affect one's access to being part of a consensus reality where we corroborate one another's perceptions. So Lisa Gunther has made a kind of similar line of argument in her book about solitary confinement, in which she shows how solitary confinement in prisons produces a kind of ontological unraveling in prisoners, actually unraveling their structures of consciousness. So this is a kind of way that we're looking at the institutions in general and power relations. How might psychiatry have such a profound effect? So I'll start by looking at epistemic oppression. So here, I apply literature on epistemic injustice to psychiatry to give insight about the way that the institution is structured. and the claims that it's committed to that I'll argue marginalizes the epistemic contributions of its users. So firstly, what is epistemic agency? So this is this denotes the ability to contribute, like someone's agency in terms of their ability to contribute to knowledge making procedures and utilize epistemic resources. So the ability to be an epistemic agent, which is a knower, so someone who can know things. And this is like illustrating the way that we're in kind of shared knowledge making processes with each other all the time. And we depend on each other to regard us as knowers in this sense. And so the kind of work of epistemic injustice is looking at like claims of justice within that. So what do we owe each other in these relations of knowledge making processes? So epistemic injustice concerns harms related to a person's capacity to be a knower and to partake in knowledge making processes. So commonly known are Bricker's concepts of testimonial injustice and hermeneutical injustice, which I'll really quickly go through. So testimonial injustice is injustice at the level of a person's testimony not being believed because of like prejudice, stereotypes against that person. So for example, something like the stereotype that a black woman is not good at philosophy and then kind of not believing her philosophical claims purely on these grounds. So that's testimonial injustice. Then hermeneutical injustice relates not to one-to-one interactions, but to shared knowledge-making procedures and how certain marginalized groups will get marginalized from such procedures. And therefore, the words and concepts, the kind of ways of conceptualizing their experiences in the consensus world will not be there. So there'll be gaps in the kind of commonly shared epistemic resources. And so hermeneutical injustice denotes the kind of injustice of this, of like not having such resources to relate to because a person's experience is so marginalized that these kind of concepts don't exist in a kind of shared reality. So both types have been argued for in psychiatry, but I'll focus on a third type, which is called contributory injustice. The term was coined by Christy Dotson, and so this denotes injustice not at the level of one-to-one interactions or shared hermeneutical resources, but at the level of different kinds of epistemic communities. So it's about the injustice of certain kinds of epistemic resources that are used by certain certain kinds of epistemic resources and certain kinds of epistemic communities. And the ones that are dominant and exert power over other epistemic communities do not recognize those other epistemic communities with as epistemic communities in their own right with their own kinds of epistemic resources. So it denotes the resources of marginalized epistemic communities kind of lacking uptake in the dominant resources that are used in society and which most people are reliant on. So for example, like medicine is something like most people are reliant on and kind of access through, like going to the doctors, things like this. And yeah, it often does not reflect the most marginalized communities' ways of knowledge making. So an example could be going to the doctors and like saying things in a certain way, um, because you know that's the kind of interaction you need to have to be believed and to kind of get to the next step in the system. So like one way of thinking about this is also with reference to language games. So this idea that there are like different language games kind of involved with different communities, and that these are like whole different worlds, so to speak, in that they're affective, they're embodied, they're habitual. So like it's not just a case of, kind of picking up certain epistemic resources from certain communities. Like it's a deeper project than that to kind of really be aware of which kinds of resources are appropriate in certain kinds of situations. Um, so like Dotson claims there are many alternative epistemologies, counter-mythologies, and hidden transcripts that exist in hermeneutically marginalized communities among themselves. And so there's marginalization that occurs through the fact that these resources are not received, promoted, or used by wider society. They do not make it into the dominant collective pool. So that's where the term like contributory injustice comes from, in that it's denoting the injustice of like certain kinds of epistemic resources not being able to contribute to this kind of wider, more dominant ways that the world works, such as institutions. Um, so yeah, Tate has kind of summed this up with these four premises, that might be, yeah, that's a way that you could kind of understand contributory injustice. Um, and so with contributory injustice, unlike hermeneutical injustice, the experience in question is not unintelligible to both the dominant group and the marginalized, since the marginalized person does have resources to understand their experience, but it's the dominant group who cannot engage with those appropriate resources. Um, And so what's required is an awareness of different kinds of hermeneutical resources in order to be able to use appropriate ones in certain contexts. And so she also explicates the difference between like the and a, in terms of like there are usually multiple kinds of epistemic resources. Um, And it's important to have an awareness of this multiplicity of many different worlds of experience and thus knowledge making. But if like one kind of system takes itself to be like the system, it's not going to have any openness to alternatives. Whereas if it takes it to be like a conceptual system, then that's completely different kind of approach. And so that's how she describes like a closed conceptual system as one that has no kind of space for other ways of knowledge making or interpreting. So yeah, a system is closed. Um, so now if we turn to like psychiatry's conceptualization of anomalous experience, um, in its it takes anomalous experiences to be symptoms of a disordered mind. And it does not take this to be one framing, it takes this to be like the fact of the matter. So it's a closed conceptual system. Often anomalous experiences are framed with threat and urgency that they must be responded to quickly as they're signs of a pathology of the mind. And so here we're looking at like the macro institutional framework of psychiatry rather than individual instances of psychiatrists taking different approaches. So I'm looking at kind of the institutional level and like norms and ways of working. And so this framework relies upon the biomedical model, which posits itself as fact rather than one particular interpretation. So it frames matters of emotion and distress according to pathology. So it does not leave open the possibility for different conceptual frameworks for dealing with this murky territory, and seeks to diagnose people and medicate them accordingly with reference to this framework. So although there is an openness to some social or environmental explanations, these are considered as amplifiers or triggers of an ultimately biologically framed condition. And so in the case of anomalous experiences, these are generally interpreted as symptoms of like an essential condition, such as schizophrenia, bipolar, or various other psychotic disorders. And by essential condition, I mean like it pertains to something about a person's whole being. And these disorders are associated with a lack of epistemic agency, since they are seen as disorders of the sense of self, disorders of the mind's understanding of itself and reality. So kind of being open to and like traveling to a person's sort of world of experience is not possible, because this interpretation blocks any pathways that try to understand the world of a person if this world is seen it as disordered and in need of treatment. So Jaspers says of schizophrenic experience that we find changes of the most general kind for which we have no empathy, but which in some way we try to make comprehensible from an external point of view. So this sums up a kind of asymmetrical relationship in which the experiences are framed in a way that assumes that they can only be understood from an external point of view, because the person's own knowledge, their own access to reality is just inherently dismissed by the existence of these symptoms. So even if psychiatric explanations for anomalous experience help some people, which no doubt they do, like the recognition of experience in an explanatory framework can be extremely helpful. But what I'm pointing to is the way that these explanations are framed is in this closed conceptual structure, which denies the epistemic agency of the people having the experiences, in the way that it blocks any alternative knowledge about such experiences. So it's a specific kind of asymmetrical relationship. It is therefore possible that this kind of closed structure provides validation for some people while still committing contributory injustice for others. And yeah, what I'm pointing to is this asymmetrical relationship between the consensus world and anomalous people having anomalous experiences, since they are framed as not being able to contribute to the consensus world or even the consensus of their own experiences. And so these assumptions of diminished epistemic agency are associated with having anomalous experiences through the association of anomalous experiences with disorders such as schizophrenia or psychotic disorders. And these assumptions are institutionally entrenched. They lead to not just these people's testimonies being denied in everyday encounters, but a wide-ranging denial of anomalous experiences' contributions to knowledge, including their contributions to knowledge about their own experiences. So like even at the kind of least stringent end of the spectrum, where people are considered to have like non-pathological anomalous experiences, these experiences are still seen as hallucinations. They're like ultimately framed as incorrect and mistaken perceptions of reality. And so this dominant framing immediately implies distrust. Experiences are considered, yeah, people who have these experiences are considered to, not be trusted, casting doubt on their ability to know. And when they are taken as pathological, which is a wide-ranging norm, there is a sense in which a person's whole being is being affected, because they are taken to be signs of a disorder of the mind, which pertains to a person's whole existence as an epistemic agent. So there's an extrapolation from like a kind of experience to an assumption about a person's ability to be a knower in a wide-ranging way. Their whole sense of reality is being questioned, and they're considered to be outside the realms of epistemic capability, or their epistemic capability is at least diminished. So we might be wondering, like, is there at least a sense in which, like, caution is warranted about the reliability of these people who are having these experiences? And I think, of course, this is appropriate in some cases, but it should be a individual case by case basis of judgment. But the concern here is in the institutional structure of psychiatry and what this entails across the board. So then the question is this generalized assumption of distrust in the epistemic agency of people who have anomalous experiences justified? And it's not the case that the assumption of distrust should be extrapolated from the mere presence of these experiences, which is what happens in the process of diagnosis. And we can look towards the idea of clinical insight as some evidence of this. So having clinical insight is when a patient is seen to agree with the psychiatric framework about their own experience. And this is considered insight. So it's considered knowledge. But when a patient appeals to any other alternative framework to understand their own experience, this is considered incorrect and is taken to be evidence that a person is more ill, thus subjugating them to the psychiatric framework. So this demonstrates how locked in people are to the closed conceptual structure. Alternative frameworks are automatically rejected and instead read as symptoms of being more ill. Possible readings of meaning or value into the experience are denied as delusional. This is an example of the closed conceptual structure in which it interprets deviations to it as mistakes, as incorrect, and the control of such mistakes is written into its very framework. So such mistakes are signs of illness which are therefore used as taken to be evidence of what the framework is claiming. So we have that psychiatry, the dominant consensus world hermeneutical resource for anomalous experience, is structured in such a way that any knowledge contribution from the people it applies to about themselves is considered wrong if it deviates from this resource, and is instead taken as evidence of what the resource is claiming. So we can sum this up into like two deeply entrenched assumptions: that these illnesses impair a person's ability to know, and that also that this perspective is the only one. So the ultimate truth rather than one way of understanding such experiences. So if someone has a different understanding of their experience, this person is deemed lacking in insight, and thus their experience is framed as a disorder of their capacity to know regardless. So it's this structural relationship that I'm drawing attention to. So how this assumption about anomalous experiences is extrapolated from the experiences and creates an intersubjective field in which the people having these experiences, their contributions are like blocked, so to speak. They are assumed not to be able to contribute to knowledge making in general, even the knowledges about their experiences. So they are distrusted, yet the clinician's epistemic resources are to be trusted. And this is the dominant attitude. And so this is an asymmetry in access to shared knowledge making. And so the argument is that this can have a profound effect in which it can affect a person's transcendental intersubjectivity, which may not have been affected to such an extent before they were part of the process of psychiatrization. And so what I'm presenting here is a mechanism. Um, so like presenting the asymmetry in terms of a person's access to shared knowledge making, including the shared knowledge making about their own reality, and how if this is sustained in the world through this kind of institutionalization, it can have a real effect on their transcendental intersubjectivity if they're not able to participate in basic processes of corroborating one another's reality. So we might be thinking, like, how do we get from there to the point that the kind of shape of intersubjectivity can be like changed in such a profound way? So that is the next part of the thesis, in which I look at the affectivity of interacting with psychiatry at various levels. So at the level of like being hospitalized, being diagnosed, and also the level of kind of having the possibility of being diagnosed, which I don't have time to go into here, but like one of the things I'm looking at is the experience of threat. Um, and so here I wanted to draw attention to the kind of mechanism for how interacting with psychiatry might create like further ruptures from intersubjectivity by looking specifically at the power relations written into its conceptualization of anomalous experience. Um, and like this creates an affectivity of threat, which like is quite plausible to think about if we think about being hospitalized and not being able to go anywhere else. The entirety of a person's like intersubjective field and access to other people is through this institution and is through these power relations. And you know, through like clinical insight and evidence, is that like contributing kind of different ways of understanding an experience is seen as evidence of being more ill and then results in more coercion. So this is a very real sense of threat. Um, and I also argue that even being diagnosed and receiving like this label is a kind of marking that comes with like a real like heaviness in terms of its stigma of having a disordered mind and the kind of relationality that that sets a person up with in relation to others in general. And then there's also the threat of being hospitalized. And so I think we can look towards some of the critical phenomenology about this uh, process of being marked in this sense, being surrounded by an atmosphere of certain uncertainty. This pertains to yeah, power relationships. Yeah, there's something insidious about the assumption kind of applying to a person over time. They may always be at threat of having their actions perceived in a way that is um, like according to the psychiatric framework and mental health legislation and might, get them coercively treated. Um, and it amounts to a kind of othering where one has been marked as a person with reduced capacity to know the world and possibly in need of coercive detainment because of this. This amounts to, yeah, an asymmetrical relationship with the consensus world, where the person cannot contribute to consensus reality with their testimony or insight because they are seen as unable to. Um, so I'll just wrap up here. Yeah, so the idea is that this can push people further away from intersubjective trust, and thereby instigate anomalous experiences or a further kind of unraveling from sharedness. The person is kind of seen as actually unable to take part in these shared processes that we're in all the time, in which we all have a stake in one another's reality. Um, yeah, like intersubjectivity relies on us kind of relating to each other as subjectivities, as able to um, corroborate our perceptions and at least have a stake in shared reality. Um, so I'll just end with, oh, whoops, um, some, yeah, implications. So, yeah, my thesis kind of points to looking at how we can create intersubjective space about anomalous experiences that is open to their content and value and other forms of knowledges about them, and kind of cultivating an attitude of openness, um, in which we can like invite them into a kind of sharedness. Um, and so I look at, yeah, peer support networks. Like, yeah, in the kind of phenomenological tradition, we have like a rich tradition of really um detailing anomalous experiences and really like looking at their content, and this like creates a shared reality about so much, so much more about these experiences. But the point is that a lot of people that have these experiences don't have access to that, and they get access to, just a very like assumptive way of looking at these experiences. Um, and as phenomenologists, I think, yeah, there's an implication to kind of stay as close as we can to the experiences that we are interested in. Um, so like critiquing our starting assumptions, um, if they may be like automatically diagnostic labels. Um, so rather than bringing in power relations from the outset in the ways that we're trying to understand things, um, trying to like stay as close to the experiences as we can without necessarily defaulting to like assumptions and then all these other relationships that are inherent in that. Um, okay, that's the end of the talk.